Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to our first video on the autonomic nervous system, which hopefully you remember, the autonomic nervous system is a branch of the motor part of the peripheral nervous system. So remember we had our CNS and our PNS. PNS had a sensory part and a motor part. Motor part then had the somatic nervous system, which was going to skeletal muscle, and the autonomic nervous system. And then we further divide the autonomic nervous system into a sympathetic and a parasympathetic division. These two divisions have got nicknames. The sympathetic is called the fight or flight division, and the parasympathetic is called the rest and digest division. And these are actually really helpful nicknames to remember when you're trying to think about what these two branches of the nervous system do to various body organs and tissues. So, as we said, the autonomic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system's motor division. Motor meaning it's sending signals to effectors. And the three major effectors of the ANS are cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And of course, we're going to control these things to maintain homeostasis. So here we see some cardiac muscle in the wall of the heart. Cardiac muscle under the control of the ANS. This is a microscopic view of the wall of the stomach. This is smooth muscle here, also under control of the ANS. Here we got a salivary gland. This is called the parotid gland. Here's another salivary gland called the submandibular gland. These are also under control of the ANS. So cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Now, the ANS, in controlling these target tissues, does something called dual innervation. So remember, we got two divisions, parasympathetic and sympathetic. And the idea behind dual innervation is that both branches send motor neurons to the same organs and tissues. Like, for example, look at the heart here. The heart is getting sympathetic neurons going to it as well as parasympathetic. So the stomach, sympathetic and parasympathetic. For just about all of these organs, both divisions send signals to them, and this is known as dual innervation. Now, along with dual innervation, there is something called antagonistic control. That means one branch will stimulate an organ and another branch will inhibit it. So for example, the sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate, while the parasympathetic nervous system decreases heart rate. So we've got the two branches both going to the same place, the heart in this case, that's dual innervation, but they're having opposite effects. That's antagonistic control. And as you can imagine, that's really important for homeostasis. All right, we've got a couple other nicknames. The sympathetic division is also known as the E division because it's activated during situations like excitement, exercise, embarrassment, and emergency. Meanwhile, the parasympathetic division is also called the D division because it's activated during situations like digestion, defecation, and diuresis. Diuresis, of course, is peeing. And we're not done with nicknames yet. The sympathetic division is also known as the thoracolumbar division because as we can see in this image here, we got our brain, we got our spinal cord, and sympathetic motor neurons come out of the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. So the sympathetic division is called the thoracolumbar division. If we get a little more specific, it's actually thoracic nerves T1 to T12, as well as lumbar nerves L1 and L2, that are going to contain these sympathetic motor neurons. So it's not the entirety of the lumbar nerves. It is all of your thoracic nerves, but not all of your lumbar nerves, just the first two. The parasympathetic division, on the other hand, is known as the craniosacral division because we can see its neurons coming out of the brainstem, that's the cranial part, as well as out of the sacral spinal cord, so craniosacral. And in fact, the cranial nerves that have parasympathetic motor neurons within them are cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Remember, cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor. Number 7 is the facial. Number 9 is the glossopharyngeal. And number 10 is the vagus. And it's actually sacral nerves 2 through 4 that have parasympathetic motor signals traveling within them. Okay, here I just see my cranial is going to have parasympathetic, my sacral parasympathetic, so craniosacral, and then my thoracic and lumbar cord, T1 to L2, are going to have sympathetic signals coming out of them, thoracolumbar. Now, another anatomical thing we must be aware of is the ANS pathway connecting the central nervous system to the effector is always a 2-neuron sequence. So in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic division, in this case we're starting in the spinal cord here, but of course remember we start in the brainstem for parasympathetic, but there's always 2 neurons between the CNS and the effector. Remember, the effector is always smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. So always 2 neurons. The 2 neurons meet at a ganglion. So because the 2 neurons meet at a ganglion, remember a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside of neuronal cell bodies outside the CNS. And because we're meeting at a ganglion, the first neuron is said to be preganglionic because it's going towards the ganglion. And the second neuron is postganglionic because it's leaving the ganglion. So we have a preganglionic neuron in each division and a postganglionic neuron in each division. The preganglionic starts in the CNS. The postganglionic starts in a ganglion and goes to the effector. Now also notice that in the sympathetic pathway, the preganglionic neuron is short, postganglionic is long, and this is flip-flopped for the parasympathetic pathway. Preganglionic is long, postganglionic is short. So just kind of reiterating what I just said. I did 2 slides information too fast. All right, another thing to notice is that the preganglionic neuron is myelinated and the postganglionic neuron is unmyelinated. This picture doesn't depict that, but we got to know the first neuron, the preganglionic one, is myelinated, then the second one is unmyelinated. Here we see our 2-neuron pathway for each. So this is our preganglionic neuron up here, starting in the CNS, and the preganglionic neuron is going to synapse with the second neuron at a ganglion, and these are each our postganglionic neurons, which are going onward to the target organ, the effector. All right, here we see the basic parasympathetic pathways from the brain, so the cranial part. So notice we got cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10, oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. In each of them, there's a 1-2 neuron pathway, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. In each of them, there is a ganglion where the 2 neurons meet. And in each of them, the first neuron is the longer one of the 2. Notice that cranial nerve number 3 is going to smooth muscle in the eye. Cranial nerve number 7 is going to glands in the nose, salivary glands, and tear glands. Cranial nerve number 9 is going to another salivary gland. Cranial nerve number 10 is going to thoracic organs like the heart and the lungs, but also going to abdominal organs like the liver, gallbladder, stomach, pancreas, and intestines. Meanwhile, the sacral parasympathetic pathways are going to the end of the large intestine, as well as reproductive and urinary structures. Now, the sympathetic pathway is more complicated than the parasympathetic because we're going to more organs. we're not only going to abdominal and thoracic organs, but we're also going to sweat glands throughout the body, arrector pili throughout the body. Remember, arrector pili are the little smooth muscles that cause hairs to stand on end, as well as vascular smooth muscle throughout the body. In order to do the sympathetic pathway, we got to do a little bit of anatomy review. There's our spinal cord. Check out those lateral horns right there. And then check out our ventral rootlets, which become the ventral root right here. Ventral root becomes the spinal nerve. Spinal nerve gives off a dorsal ramus, a ventral ramus. The ventral ramus give off these guys called rami communicantes, which go into what's called a sympathetic trunk. This vertical structure is a sympathetic trunk. And notice the many sympathetic trunk ganglia in here, as well as various nerves coming out of it. So here is one sympathetic pathway. This is how we go from the spinal cord to effectors in the skin of the neck, torso, and limbs. So we're talking blood vessels, sweat glands, and arrector pili. We're starting in the lateral horn. Our preganglionic neuron is going through the ventral root, through the spinal nerve, through the ventral ramus, through a white ramus communicans. Remember, the preganglionic guy here, the preganglionic neuron, is myelinated. That's why it's going through what's called a white ramus communicans. Then we have our two neurons meeting here in the sympathetic trunk at this sympathetic trunk ganglion. And then our postganglionic neuron leaves the trunk via a gray ramus communicans back to the ventral ramus, then onward to wherever in the skin we happen to be going. So this is one fundamental basic pathway. All right, another pathway is really, really simple. Simple, not simple. It's not simple. I meant to say really, really similar. We're still starting in a lateral horn. The preganglionic neuron goes through the ventral root. The preganglionic neuron gets into the spinal nerve, ventral ramus, white ramus communicans. And then as it gets into the sympathetic trunk, instead of immediately synapsing on that ganglion at the same level, it either goes up or goes down to a different level and stimulates with a postganglionic neuron. In a ganglion, it's either higher up or lower down. And what this is going to do is let us just get to more places in our body. And so in a different level of a ganglion, we have our synapse. The postganglionic neuron leaves via the gray ramus communicans again. And again, notice it's gray because this is an unmyelinated neuron. Back to the ventral ramus and onward to our effectors. Okay, another possibility starts the same way. Lateral horn, ventral root, spinal nerve, ventral ramus, white ramus communicans. But this time, the preganglionic neuron does not stop in the sympathetic trunk. Instead, it goes right through. It exits into a nerve emanating from the sympathetic trunk called a splanchnic nerve, and onward to a ganglion in front of the vertebral column. So it's called a prevertebral ganglion, and it's inside that prevertebral ganglion that our two neurons meet, and our postganglionic neuron then continues onward towards target tissues in the abdominal and pelvic cavities. Okay, another pathway which is very different, although it starts similarly, but overall there's going to be a fundamental difference here. We're starting in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Preganglionic neuron is going into the ventral root, spinal nerve, ventral ramus, white ramus communicans, through the trunk, into a thoracic splanchnic nerve, and then onward to the adrenal gland, which is sitting on top of the kidney. And in the adrenal gland, the preganglionic neurons synapses with modified postganglionic neurons called adrenal medulla cells that then release hormones. These are fight or flight hormones called epinephrine and norepinephrine, and those fight or flight hormones end up going into the blood. So, those are our many pathways for our sympathetic system. What I want to do now is look at the neurotransmitters involved. So, remember, 2-neuron pathway always. This is my sympathetic in this picture here. Got my short preganglionic meeting my longer postganglionic in a neighboring ganglion. Notice that the sympathetic preganglionic neuron is releasing a hormone called a neurotransmitter, called acetylcholine. And because this neuron releases acetylcholine, it's called a cholinergic neuron. My sympathetic postganglionic neuron, on the other hand, which is the one going from the ganglion to the target tissue, so the effector, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or gland, this guy releases a different neurotransmitter, norepinephrine. And because of this, he's called an adrenergic neuron. Think about adrenergic like adrenaline, which is like another name for epinephrine, which is your fight or flight hormone. Okay, so that was our sympathetic pathway. In the parasympathetic pathway, the preganglionic neuron is releasing acetylcholine, so it's cholinergic. The postganglionic neuron is also cholinergic because it's releasing acetylcholine onto the target tissue. So note that the most common neurotransmitter here was, in fact, acetylcholine. Now, the acetylcholine released by those neurons has got to bind to a particular receptor to exert an effect. And the receptors that bind to acetylcholine are known as cholinergic receptors. And there are actually two varieties of cholinergic receptors. One are called nicotinic and the other is called muscarinic. So notice my preganglionic sympathetic neuron is releasing acetylcholine. It'll bind to a cholinergic nicotinic receptor on my postganglionic neuron. Notice that my parasympathetic preganglionic neuron releasing acetylcholine also binding to a cholinergic nicotinic receptor. And also, let's notice that in my somatic pathway, going to skeletal muscle, again, it's acetylcholine being released. We talked about this in the muscle lecture. And the receptor there is also a nicotinic receptor. I have a muscarinic receptor just on my target tissues. So on my smooth muscle, my cardiac muscle, and my glands. Now we got to figure out what actually happens when acetylcholine binds to these nicotinic or cholinergic receptors. Okay, here we see a nicotinic receptor. It is actually a sodium channel. So when acetylcholine binds to it, the channel opens, sodium rushes in, and that causes a graded potential, a depolarization. Now, in the case of the nicotinic receptor on the neuron here, it's going to allow this postganglionic neuron to send an action potential. So, when acetylcholine binds to nicotinic receptors, creates a graded potential, which can let the neuron send an action potential. And by the way, this receptor is called a nicotinic receptor because not only does it respond to acetylcholine, but it also responds to, you guessed it, nicotine. Now, muscarinic receptors are found on our parasympathetic target organs. So our parasympathetic, the glands, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. And in this case, the muscarinic receptor that binds acetylcholine activates this intracellular thing called a G protein, which can then cause a variety of responses. Because think about it. If it's skeletal, sorry, if it's smooth muscle, we might need it to contract or relax. Ditto for cardiac muscle. If it's a gland, we might need it to secrete something. So a simple like ion channel is not going to work in this case. Okay, so those are my two varieties of cholinergic receptors. Let's talk about what acetylcholine does. It causes digestive tract smooth muscle to contract. So the smooth muscle in the intestines, the stomach, the esophagus gets to contract. It causes digestive glands to secrete. So like stomach secretions, pancreatic secretions, intestinal secretions. It causes salivary glands to increase their salivation. It is going to decrease heart rate. And again, notice we're living up to our rest and digest nickname here. It also causes contraction of urinary bladder smooth muscle. So remember, it's the D division, and the D is for diuresis, defecation, and digestion. Other effects of acetylcholine include constriction of the pupil and contraction of airway smooth muscle. This is known as bronchoconstriction. And this is going to restrict airflow into and out of our lungs. All right, let's switch gears now. Because if we're in our sympathetic system, we know the first neuron is cholinergic, releasing acetylcholine, but the second neuron is adrenergic, meaning it's releasing norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is going to bind to adrenergic receptors. And there are two big varieties of adrenergic receptors. There's alphas and there's betas. And there are going to be a variety of responses. Again, it kind of depends like what the tissue is. Is it cardiac muscle or smooth muscle? Is it a gland? Different tissues are going to need to do different things. Now, overall, norepinephrine, which is our sympathetic neurotransmitter, as well as epinephrine, which is our sympathetic hormone, they're going to cause digestive smooth muscle to relax. They're going to decrease digestive gland secretion and decrease salivation. In terms of the heart, they increase heart rate. They also increase the squeezing power of the heart, the cardiac contraction. And this is going to result in an increase in stroke volume, which is the amount of blood released per contraction, like per beat, as well as cardiac output, which is the amount of blood pumped per minute. So we're increasing the amount of blood pumped per beat, that's stroke volume, and the amount of blood pumped per minute, that's cardiac output. Other effects include relaxing urinary bladder smooth muscle, causing arterial vasoconstriction, which is going to raise blood pressure, causing sweat glands. Where's a sweat gland? There's a sweat gland. Causing sweat glands to make more sweat, causing arrector pili muscles to contract, giving you piloerection or goosebumps, causing pupillary dilation, as well as dilation of bronchioles, airway smooth muscle relaxing. So those are some major effects of the sympathetic system. Now, in terms of the sympathetic response, we got to realize it is broad. And what that means is it is usually multiple organs turning on at the same time, which makes sense. If I'm in a fight or flight situation, I want to get all my organs in that ready state. And so it's a body-wide, multi-organ systemic effect of the sympathetic response. And there's two reasons. One reason is because we're going to notice something in this picture that wasn't depicted earlier, but the preganglionic neuron is actually rather branched. That means there's one preganglionic neuron can go to multiple postganglionic neurons, and we can get a wider range of effects that way. So that's one reason for this broad distribution. The other reason is to remember, when we turn on our sympathetic nervous system, one of the things we're going to act on is the adrenal gland. And in the inside the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla, there are modified cells in there that secrete epinephrine and a little bit of norepinephrine into the blood. And they're acting as sympathetic hormones. And by going into the blood, well, they're going everywhere, right? So that's why it's a body-wide systemic response. Now, we can contrast this with the parasympathetic response, which is narrower. There's no branching of the preganglionic neurons, so it's a one-to-one. And also, there's no hormone release the same way there is with epinephrine. And parasympathetic can be more organ-specific because it's not the same level of danger that we think about with our fight or flight response. Okay, another thing to consider about these two responses is the duration. The parasympathetic response is brief. Remember, acetylcholine is released onto the target organs. And the thing is, acetylcholine is quickly broken down by an enzyme in the synapse called acetylcholinesterase. So acetylcholinesterase breaks down acetylcholine, leaving not much time for the acetylcholine to impact the effector. So it's going to be a brief parasympathetic response. Meanwhile, remember our sympathetic pathway, norepinephrine is released onto the target tissue. Norepinephrine is removed from the synaptic cleft by being vacuumed up by a transport protein in the presynaptic axon. And this process of reuptake is relatively slow. So there's a longer response time for the sympathetic nervous system. Plus, it's also longer because it takes a while for the liver to break down the epinephrine that's released by the adrenal gland. Again, think about the sympathetic fight or flight response as being like a life or death situation. So it makes sense that we keep this response on to ensure that we have enough time to, deal with, run away or fight away, whatever our threat might be. Okay, final thing to discuss, and we're going to be done this ANS video, is that earlier we talked about the antagonistic setup. We talked about dual innervation, how the two branches, symp and parasymp, go to the same place, and how they do the same thing. We call that antagonistic control. But there's a couple situations where, one in males, one in females basically, where the systems are more so working together towards a common goal. So for example, we got male reproductive organs here. We got a penis, we got a scrotum with testes and epididymis, got a vas deferens, seminal vesicle, prostate gland, bulbourethral gland. And parasympathetic signals are going to cause penile arterial vasodilation, which is what allows the penis to become engorged with blood and creates an erection. While sympathetic signals don't oppose that. Instead, sympathetic signals cause the epididymis to propel sperm and testicular fluid, cause the seminal vesicles to make seminal fluid, the prostate gland to make prostatic fluid, and the sympathetic then causes all the smooth muscle in the various ducts and in the urethra to contract, and that results in ejaculation. So it's not really opposing. It's not saying, okay, this one makes something go one way and the other goes the other way. Instead, we got two related and processes that require one another in the male reproductive system. So erection is a parasympathetic event, while ejaculation is a sympathetic event. Now, a similar situation is going to occur in the female repro organs. So parasympathetic signals cause pudendal vasodilation, so erectile tissue in the clitoris, erectile tissue in the vestibular bulbs around the vagina. They're all going to engorge with blood. And then sympathetic signals are going to cause secretion from the various reproductive glands, like the greater vestibular glands, and other things we'll talk about in AP2. But again, there is this cooperation as opposed to an antagonistic situation. All right, I want to end this lecture by talking about the autonomic versus the somatic nervous system. Remember, autonomic went to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, and it could both stimulate or inhibit activity depending on what the situation was. Somatic always goes to skeletal muscle, always stimulatory, always makes it contract. Somatic always releases acetylcholine. Autonomic is either norepinephrine for sympathetic or acetylcholine for parasympathetic. Autonomic is always a 2-neuron pathway, with the first neuron being myelinated and the second neuron being unmyelinated. Somatic is always a single neuron pathway, and that neuron is heavily myelinated. So really quick speed here, much slower speed of response down here. So effectors of the somatic nervous system, like we just said, are skeletal muscles, and the response is always contraction. I'm actually going to skip these last 2 slides, so we're going to call it quits. We are done with our autonomic nervous system lecture. So we're done with the nervous system, in fact. I will see you next time as we talk about the muscular system.